My name is Richard Reyna, and I want to welcome you to this wonderful forum this evening. It's actually my first time ever participating in one of these, so I'm very excited to see how this all unfolds. Hopefully you all know that I'm with Guadalupe Radio Network, Catholic radio in South and Central Texas, and if you don't already tune in, please tune your radios to 89.7 or download our free app. There's my little 2 cents. I want to thank the Knights of Columbus. They're going to be helping us throughout the evening, distributing cards for some of the questions you may have. You can write them on them. During the break, we'll make sure and get those cards out to you, and please get them back to the Knights of Columbus so we can get them up here and you can ask your questions. Also, obviously, I want to thank Father Christopher Phillips and Father Jeff Moore and Our Lady of the Atonement for hosting us this evening. This is something we need to be having everywhere. I'd love to see this happening every month, but thank you for allowing us to come to your home, Father. And again, this forum is part of the Fortnight for Freedom. I encourage you to look up more information about what that is, and I'm sure we'll hear more from our two panelists here about that. But you can also go to various websites and get more information about that as well. Yeah, do that, please. And then there is a big need for civility. If you've got a question or something that doesn't sit well with you, please contain yourself and write your question down, whatever it may be, so when we get to the Q&A part of this evening, your voice will be heard. And if it gets a little bit too disruptive, I might have to come down there and chat with you, and I don't want to do that. And then if you have a cell phone with you, if you're like me, you're going to forget to put it on vibrate, and it will go off when somebody's speaking right at the wrong moment. So please mute your cell phone, put it on vibrate. I won't tell you to turn it off because you might need to get a phone call. And if you do, please don't engage in conversation at your seat. If you need to take it, please go out to the back. I would appreciate it. Again, welcome to this public forum on marriage and the contemporary debate on the meaning of marriage. This forum is presented by two local apostolates. Hopefully you all have started to hear about them now. One of the newer ones, the Mother of the Americas Institute, a think tank for the new evangelization, which is dedicated to developing new means and methods for evangelizing and educating those involved in the new evangelization. And then the St. Joseph Foundation, doing some great work here, whose mission is to assist faithful Catholics in using the means established by the Church, the system of canon law, to obtain remedies for violations of their rights within the Church. You can hear more about those two organizations as we continue. But our panelists today are Mr. Michael Dunnigan and David Delaney. Woo! For those of you who do not know Michael Dunnigan is an attorney practicing in both the Anglo-American system of common law and the Catholic Church's legal system known as canon law. He received his law degree from Georgetown, his licentiate in canon law from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, and his master's in theology from St. Mary's University. Mr. Dunnigan is admitted to practice law in Texas and Arizona, and he currently serves as general counsel to the St. Joseph Foundation, a lay apostolate here in San Antonio dedicated to canon law. The foundation's publication is called Christi Fidelis, and it focuses on canon law, the rights of the faithful, and the exercise of authority in the Church. If you'd like more information about the St. Joseph Foundation or Christi Fidelis, Mr. Dunnigan has brochures at the back of the hall here. When we're done, you can pick some of those up. I'm sure he'd love for you to help get the word out about his wonderful organization. And Dr. David Delaney is a systematic theologian and director of the Mother of the Americas Institute. Among various areas of research interests, he has a particular interest in theological anthropology, including the theology of marriage and family. Dr. Delaney has taught theological anthropology, including St. John Paul II's theology of the body at the graduate and undergraduate levels. As an academic dean, he developed the curriculum for a master's program in concentration on marriage and family. And Dr. Delaney is currently working on a project to develop a think tank, which will help serve the new evangelization. And without further ado, let's just get into the meat of this. I got a question here for you already, Mr. Dunnigan, if I may. The title of this forum is One Man, One Woman. Is there still a case for traditional marriage? So I'm going to ask, is there? Leaving aside religion for the moment, is there a case in law and public policy for the traditional understanding of marriage. And for those of us who are not lawyers, so I'm not, please include in your answer a short summary of the legal history of same-sex marriage.
Thank you. Mr. Rania, Dr. Delaney, Father Phillips, Father Moore, Atonement community, and fellow citizens, thank you. What we actually wanted to talk to you about tonight was the San Antonio downtown streetcar proposal. But Father Phillips thought that would be too controversial. So we're left with this subject. I'll give you a brief legal history, but focused more on our recent cases, because I think that's why most of us are here. There are a couple of kind of pillars to keep in mind before we get into the specifics. One is that the family based on marriage between one man and one woman who establish a household and bear and raise children, that is a universal phenomenon in all societies that we know of that have ever existed. That's kind of point one. Point two is that same-sex relationships also have existed in many societies throughout history. And point three would be, despite the presence of same-sex relationships in many societies, few, if any, societies ever have contemplated same-sex marriage until recent decades. No jurisdiction ever recognized same-sex marriage until the year 2000. As late as 2006, the highest court in New York State said, until a few decades ago, it was an accepted truth for almost everyone who ever lived in any society in which marriage existed that there could be marriage only between participants of different sexes. As we're thinking about the legal history, I think there are two observations we can keep in mind. One is from Oliver Wendell Holmes. He said, "It is revolting to have no better reason for a rule of law than that so it was laid down in the time of Henry IV. It is still more revolting if the grounds upon which it was laid down have vanished long since, and the rule simply persists from blind imitation of the past." I think defenders of traditional marriage have to keep this point in mind and ask themselves, are they blindly imitating the past, or do they understand and have reasons for promoting traditional marriage between one man and one woman? And something that proponents of same-sex marriage on the other pole can keep in mind is a quotation that I'll just paraphrase from G.K. Chesterton. He was talking specifically about reform movements, and he said that you should never tear down a fence, using a fence as a reform image. Never tear down a fence until you first understand why it was put up in the first place. Don't even think about it until you know why someone put it up. So let's try to remember both of these poles as we get into the history. The gay rights legal movement started in 1971, and in that year a case went to the Minnesota Supreme Court. That was the first case by a gay couple wishing to marry. They lost the case. They sued on the basis of the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause, and they lost their case. That was in 1971. Then over the next 2 or 2.5 decades, there were a half dozen suits in other states and the District of Columbia, and all of those cases lost as well. Those also were suits by gay couples, same-sex couples wishing to marry, and they all lost. And then kind of a watershed happened in the early to mid-1990s in Hawaii. What happened was that the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that denying a marriage license to same-sex couples is discriminatory under the Hawaii Constitution. And the reason that was important, even though it was only a case under the Hawaii Constitution, is that there was now a threat that people in other states could go to Hawaii and get married, and then their marriages would have to be recognized in, say, Texas. And the reason for that is the full faith and credit clause in the U.S. Constitution. That's why we recognize New Mexico marriages, because we have to recognize the public acts of other states. And the threat was that we would have to recognize these, or every state would have to recognize these same-sex marriages performed in Hawaii. So in 1996, Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act. It was passed overwhelmingly, 85-14 in the Senate and 342 to 67 in the House of Representatives, and was signed by President Clinton. And it had two important provisions. One said that for purposes of federal law, marriage is defined as one man and one woman only. And it also said that as far as the states go, they do not have to recognize the same-sex marriages of other states. So it was sort of a solution to the Hawaii problem. Even if a same-sex couple were married in Hawaii, Texas would not have to recognize it as marriage. In 1999, the Vermont Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples were entitled to all the same benefits as opposite-sex spouses. But they permitted the legislature to create some other category, and that's what the legislature did. It created civil unions, which gave same-sex couples all the benefits of marriage, but not the name. Then in 2003, for the first time, a state actually ruled that same-sex couples could marry, that it was illegal, unconstitutional under the state constitution to prevent the marriage of same-sex couples. That was the state of Massachusetts. So again, you have the Hawaii threat. So over the next 2 years, from about 2004 to 2006, 24 or so states, including Texas, passed constitutional amendments defining marriage as one man, one woman. Then the lawsuits started, of course. So from 2008 to 2009, there were about a handful of state Supreme Court cases striking down these marriage laws, the traditional marriage laws. In 2009, Vermont became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage by legislative action. Up until now, there had only been court cases. This was the first time in 2009 that it was actually the representatives of the people who voted for same-sex marriage. The attitude of President Obama in this period, he originally said he was not in favor of same-sex marriage, but then in 2011, he stopped defending the Defense of Marriage Act. That was the 1996 law that Congress passed to solve the Hawaii problem. And a few months later, in July, he actually started attacking that law and started comparing it to racial discrimination. Then in 2012, he gave a television interview, and then he came out and he actually endorsed same-sex marriage. He changed his position. In that same year, 2012, voters in 4 states voted on ballot measures on whether to legalize same-sex marriage. In 3 states, Maryland, Washington, and Maine, the voters approved of same-sex marriage. And this was the first time it had been actually put to the voters, and voters had approved of same-sex marriage, and that was 3 states. 1 state in that election year, Minnesota, voted it down. Then came, just last year, the big Supreme Court case that you probably all heard about, U.S. versus Windsor. And that case was about the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, the 1996 law that President Clinton had signed. That case concerned a lesbian couple that had married in Canada, and then they moved to, or they were from New York, they went to Canada to get married, and then returned to New York. New York did not have same-sex marriage, but they recognized valid same-sex marriages performed in other places. Then one of the couple died in 2009, and I guess they were quite well off because there was a very large estate tax of over $300,000. So the surviving member of the couple applied for relief from the estate tax, but there was no exemption under federal law for same-sex couples as there would be for married couples, and that's what the case was about. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal government cannot define marriage as one man, one woman. They struck down this part of DOMA. But they said the states still can. The states still can have traditional marriage laws, but the federal government, under the U.S. Constitution, the federal government cannot have a traditional marriage law. Much of the decision, it's a very confusing decision, and much of it was taken up with really impugning the motives of the proponents of traditional marriage. They said that if you're for traditional marriage, or if the people who voted for DOMA in Congress, what they were trying to do is impose a disadvantage on same-sex couples and impose a stigma and humiliate the children of these couples. And there was really no other purpose except to demean same-sex couples, is what the Supreme Court said. One interesting thing is that the actual basis of the decision is very unclear. There are three possible bases for the decision, but the Supreme Court very much vacillated between the three and was not clear about the basis of the decision. Usually the man on the street isn't too concerned about that. They really just want to know the bottom line of what the court decided. But in this case, it's important because one of the possible rationales for striking down this law was the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution. But you could call this an element of due process only if it were a fundamental right deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Obviously, same-sex marriage is not traditionally rooted in our history and tradition. So they did no analysis. They said that this was one of the possible bases of their decision, but they did no real due process analysis or explain how same-sex marriage could be recognized as a fundamental right deeply rooted in our history. Another possible basis of the law is the Equal Protection Clause, and that was even more confounding, because if they wanted to say that it deprived same-sex couples of equal protection under the law, under the Constitution, they would have to, logically, they would have to analyze same-sex couples versus opposite-sex couples and determine, is there any difference between them? Are they really in the same situation? But they didn't do that. They just said that this was an offense to equal protection principles, but they didn't do the regular analysis that courts usually do. In a dissent, Justice Scalia said that what the court really did was to cheat both sides, because it deprived the winners of an honest victory by having such a confused basket of rationales without ever deciding on one, and it deprived the losers of the peace that comes from an honest defeat. To really settle this debate, we really need to ask the question of what marriage is, and the court never did that. In another dissenting opinion, Justice Alito goes through that and says you really can't ask, are same-sex couples in the same condition as opposite-sex couples, unless you ask, well, what is marriage at base? And the court never did that. And Justice Alito went on to say that's really not for courts to do, that's for the people in the legislatures, their elected representatives, to do. What I think the court has done in this unfortunate case, again to borrow from Chesterton, is to take apart a complex machine, piece by piece, without ever pausing to ask what it's really for. Why does the state recognize marriage? Why does the state have any interest in it? So in my opinion, we have the worst of both worlds. The Supreme Court has supposedly settled this debate, but has never really engaged in it. It settles this question saying same-sex couples have to be permitted marriage without ever asking or deciding what marriage is, and without explaining what it's for and why the state has an interest in it. That decision, Windsor, was decided almost exactly a year ago. Tomorrow will be its birthday. And in the years since Windsor, there have been a slew of decisions. Going into the Windsor case, there were 41 states that had laws or constitutional provisions defining marriage the traditional way as one man and one woman. And there were 9 states, plus the District of Columbia, that recognized same-sex marriage. That's in about early to mid-2013. Since then, 7 more states have adopted same-sex marriage, most by legislation. So the situation we're in right now today is that same-sex marriage is basically legal in 1/3 of the U.S., in 16 states plus the District of Columbia. But in 34 states, including Texas, traditional marriage is the rule. But there's also been a slew of cases where federal courts have recently, including in Texas, have ruled our state constitutional provisions protecting marriage unconstitutional. Most of those cases have been about somewhere between 10 and 14 cases like that in the federal court system. And just today, one of the cases finally was decided by an intermediate level federal court, and it also was in favor of same-sex marriage and against traditional marriage. That concerned Utah's law. That really is where we stand right now. We're waiting for those federal decisions, waiting to see what happens. There's probably a decent chance that Texas's intermediate level court, its circuit court, will go the other way and possibly uphold the Texas statute. It's a more conservative court than the one that just voted down Utah's law. But of course we don't know, and needless to say, we can expect these cases to go to the Supreme Court to decide, can the states really still embrace traditional marriage? That's where we are legally. In public policy, as I said, there's really 2 views of marriage at stake, and Justice Alito recognized this in his opinion. There's the traditional view can be called the conjugal view, and then the other view could be called just the new view, or the revisionist, or the pro-same-sex marriage view. The conjugal view of marriage can be described as the institution that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife to be father and mother to any children that their sexual union produces. The features of the conjugal union are that it's comprehensive. It concerns both mind and body. And it's marked by permanence, fidelity, and exclusivity. And a key purpose is to bear and raise children. That's the conjugal view. The revisionist view is very different. The key feature is emotional intensity. The person you marry is sometimes described by some pro-same-sex marriage proponents as your number 1 adult relationship. So there's emotional intensity, and there's a stated commitment, and it's your number 1 relationship, and they want to get married for social validation. These other marks of conjugal marriage that we've talked about are not necessarily present. And of the 2 views, only one of them really explains why the state has any interest in marriage at all. The state is not interested in our friendships. The state doesn't know who your best friend is. It's not very interested in your brothers and sisters. It's really not interested in most of your relationships. But it's very interested in your marriage. And the reason for that is because of the connection between marriage and the bearing and raising of children. Society needs new citizens for its own survival, and the U.S. Supreme Court itself has recognized this. A mother is always going to be present when a child is born, but the great social question is whether a father also will be present. And if he is present, how long will he be present? Social science shows that children tend to do better when they're raised by both a mother and a father. And studies also show that even left-leaning studies show that mothers and fathers are not interchangeable, that mommies don't make good daddies and daddies simply do not make good mommies. Marriage also tends to keep together, and the conjugal view explains that it keeps together things that have a tendency to fly apart. Men and women. They get together, but they don't always stay together. Sex and love, same thing. Sex and marriage. Parents and their children. Society wants to keep these things together for the good of society and the good of people, and recognizing marriage and helping marriage is the state's interest, and it's why it promotes and honors marriage.
If families don't raise their children, if parents don't raise the children that they have, then the state is going to have to do it, or is going to have to help with it. This is enormously expensive, as we all know, and the state is ill-suited. It's expensive, and the state does a very bad job at it. The traditional family is the best and most efficient and least restrictive way to raise children. A case in California in the 1950s said outright, the reason that the state recognizes marriage is because it channels biological drives that might otherwise become socially destructive, and it ensures care and education of children in a stable environment. What's kind of interesting is this is very similar to the way Edmund Burke described chivalry. It sounds like it's a completely different thing, but he says what chivalry does is it pacifies and beautifies two crucial relationships that often become dangerous. One is the relationship between men and women, and the other is the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. And what chivalry does, and there's a key component is sexual complementarity in the man-woman part, is that it recognizes different roles and gives each a person a reason to honor that commitment. The states that uphold marriage, that are arguing in favor of marriage, they embrace this conjugal view in some way. Unfortunately, they're not always all that good at explaining it. Chesterton also said that sometimes a thing can be too big to see, and I think sometimes when you look at the state's explanations, you realize that they're not even all that good at explaining. Even when you ask yourself, well, what is marriage? You know what it is, but it's really hard to actually say, well, these are the features. It seems so obvious that when you're really put to it, it's hard to say. I would say that the state really doesn't define marriage at all. It really recognizes marriage as a pre-existing and prior institution. The revisionist view is sometimes described as expanding the pie. Just let's open it up to same-sex couples. But what it's really more about is redefining and radically altering marriage. Of the marks of marriage that we've discussed, exclusivity, monogamy, the raising of children, all that really remains is the emotional basis and a commitment for at least some period. The problem is if marriage is about emotional intensity can fade. And if you're disconnecting marriage from children, then there really isn't as much reason to maintain the other marks of marriage. It's the same thing with permanence. If emotion fades, permanence is going to suffer. The same with exclusivity. If emotional intensity is the basis of the union, then why does it have to be exclusive? You can have intense emotional feelings for more than one person. And indeed, we see that advocated. Some advocates of same-sex marriage are now also advocating truly group marriages. And the difficulty is that if society doesn't have a well-defined understanding of marriage, then it becomes harder for people to live it out. It just doesn't make as much sense to live out the norms of marriage. Some gay activists even admit that these marks of marriage are going to fall away. Dan Savage said that his idea of marriage is as not monogamous, but monogamish. Andrew Sullivan said that if gays are allowed to marry, they can teach straight people about so-called flexibility in marriage, meaning, of course, infidelity. Ellen Willis said she celebrated the fact that if we confer legitimacy of marriage on homosexual relations, that will introduce an implicit revolt against the institution into its very heart. She's actually saying she's promoting same-sex marriage because she wants to radically alter what marriage is. E.J. Graff, another activist, said that he wants to cut the link between sex and diapers. Michelangelo Signorile, another activist, said that he doesn't want same-sex marriage so that gay couples can adhere to society's moral norms, but he wants it to, quote, radically alter an archaic institution.
There are others as well, but there's not really a fringe position in the gay community. There are a lot of gay activists who are against marriage at all and really don't want it to be promoted. And then there's a very strong trend like this that really wants it, but wants a very different type of definition. So in my view, I think that we have really, as I said, the worst of both worlds. The Supreme Court supposedly has settled this issue, but it's never really engaged it. This debate between the conjugal view and the revisionist view really should not be settled by the court. Courts are not suited to evaluate these kinds of fact-based and even some of these principle-based distinctions, as the Windsor majority opinion shows. They settle it without talking about the actual definition of marriage. Also, it's undemocratic to leave it to the courts. This question should be left to the people and to their representatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunnigan. And now to a theological approach to it. Dr. Delaney, in the public debate on same-sex marriage, it's clear that the Catholic Church is against it. But can you tell us, what does the Catholic Church believe about marriage and why?
Thank you, Richard. Yes. At the outset, let me say that I'll stay very close to my notes so I don't take up too much of your time. But I also have to admit that to fully treat of the Catholic Church's teaching on the meaning of marriage and to comprehensively respond to criticisms against it would require a semester-long course. Short of that, what I would propose as the way forward for my short introductory comments is to present an abbreviated outline of certain fundamental truths the Church holds about the meaning of marriage. Perhaps this could provoke some questions to be addressed in the question and answer period. I will then spend the remaining time tracing the outlines of the theological rationale for what I think is the central question raised by our contemporary social situation. Namely, why does the Church insist that authentic marriage can only exist between two persons who are sexually complementary? Let's first turn to the 8 brief propositions I mentioned. These really need to be understood if one is to understand the Church's teaching about the human person and the marital covenant. First, the human person is created in the image of God, and this reveals his dignity and his purpose for existing. Second, marriage is ordered to the way man images God, and so marriage necessarily plays a fundamental role in integral human flourishing. That is, social flourishing and individual flourishing, body and soul. Third, marriage irreplaceably contributes to integral human flourishing because it is uniquely ordered to the deepest truth about the human person. That is, that individuals are created for rightly ordered relationships with others. The sign of authenticity of the unique human relationship called marriage is its ordering to life-giving fruitfulness. Fourth, marriage and the family are foundational social institutions upon which every other larger social institution depends for its health. Therefore, a flourishing society is possible only when it is comprised of healthy and flourishing marriages and families. As such, authentic marriage is never purely a private matter. It is an eminently social concern as well. Fifth, marriage can only be considered such when it conforms to the order of nature as we have described it. That is, it must be an irrevocable, faithful, lifelong communion of two sexually complementary persons, which is ordered to life-giving fruitfulness. In other words, the only relationship that can be called marriage is the covenantal communion between one man and one woman. Sixth, a man and a woman, and only a man and a woman, have a right to a marriage because, for those who are called to it, they have a unique capacity and so an attendant duty to contribute to integral human flourishing of themselves, of any children, and of society. Seventh, Catholic teaching on marriage is not legal positivism. Rather, it is based upon the order of nature which arises from creation's participation in God's perfection. In other words, no one is able to redefine or distort the institution of marriage without necessarily experiencing negative consequences which follow a causal progression similar to violations of other laws of nature. Eighth, and finally, the essence of these truths can be reached by the use of human reason alone. through a dispassionate consideration of the order of nature. Now, some of these propositions will be illuminated in what follows, but not all. Again, we can address any of them in the subsequent question and answer period. But we now must turn to what I have suggested to be the fundamental question. What is the theological rationale underlying the Church's insistence on reciprocal sexual complementarity for authentic conjugal union? Well, the best place to start to answer this question is the first Genesis creation narrative. Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28 goes this way. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air, and every moving thing that lives upon the earth. Here there are many remarkable implications for the dignity and the meaning of the human person, but two stand out for our purposes. The first is that man is made in the image and likeness of God. And the second is that man is also the image of God as male and female. And man's image in God is directly tied to man's capacity for procreative fruitfulness. Let's first consider the image of God, or the schoolmen, as they called it, the imago Dei. Theologians have traditionally emphasized the imago Dei in terms of man's spiritual faculties, that is, the intellect and the will. However, the end, the purpose, the telos of these faculties is for the purpose of love, that is, for the purpose of rightly serving relationships. The first letter of John twice says God is love. Now, the imago Dei tells us that we must make recourse to what we know about God in order to understand what this structure of human love is. The tradition describing the hierarchical structure of the relations among the persons of the Trinity is called the divine processions. These processions are necessary to understand for our task here. Before explaining them, I should point out that the spiritual faculties describe man as an image of God from the perspective of God as pure spirit, that is, in the philosophical category of substance or nature. However, recently the imago Dei has been studied based upon Christ's revelation that God is a Trinity, that is, a communion of persons, a family. The processions describe this communion in terms of their relations to one another. As we say in the Creed, the Son is begotten, not made. That is, the Son comes from God, but he is not created. He's not a creature. He is God. This is the first procession. With respect to the Holy Spirit, we say that he proceeds from the Father and the Son. This is the second procession. The Son's procession is called generation, or begetting, and the Holy Spirit's procession is called spiration, or the breathing forth of the Holy Spirit from the reciprocal love of the Father and the Son. Now, I know this might be a little bit complicated at first, but hopefully as we go along, you'll get the main gist of what the implications of this are. Now, the early church fathers described these two divine processions based upon John's prologue, that is, the prologue to John's Gospel, John chapter 1. There it says the Son is the eternal Word, the eternal Logos. Looking at the analogy of this Logos, the divine Word, the eternal Word, with the human intellect, we see that the Son proceeds from the Father. He proceeds eternally from the Father in a similar way that a mental word comes forth from a human person. In both, the Word is the same nature, but it's not the same person. It's not the same who, if you will. It's not an identity. In God the Son, therefore, we can see, since he comes forth from the Father, receives himself completely from the Father in the Father's eternal knowing, God's eternal act of the intellect. The Son returns himself in a reciprocal act of total self-gift, God's eternal act of the will. This reciprocity in eternity is infinite. In infinite perfect being is a third divine person, the Holy Spirit. The early church fathers, therefore, also referred to the Holy Spirit as love. That is, the love that binds the Father and the Son. They also called the Holy Spirit communion, the communion between the Father and the Son, or among the three of them. He is that in his very essence. This is what love is. It's an act of reciprocal total self-gift. And in fact, that reciprocal total self-gift is fruitful. It's life-giving. The telos, the end, the purpose of the intellect, therefore, is to know the other. And that of the will is to love the other, to will the other's good, to act for the other's good. Therefore, this is the archetype for the human person. And this brings us to the second way that man images God, which we read in the Genesis text. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his treatise on angels, is the first theologian I have found to make reference to the unity between these two aspects of man being like God. St. Thomas says that in an absolute sense, that is, as we have said, in the order of nature, angels are more like God because God and angels are both pure spirit. Yet this is a surprising insight. Thomas says that man is more like God in a relational or relative sense. He says that in divinity, God begets God, just as in humanity, man begets man. This is remarkable. This is very remarkable. What this says is that in our bodies, man gives himself the capacity to reflect God, to reflect God's life-giving, fruitful love in a way that is like God, that even the angels do not possess. Though, of course, the difference between man's begetting and God's begetting is infinitely greater than the similarity. But still, there is this same analogy. Here it's important to say a bit about the reason that man must necessarily reflect God's perfection, and therefore to conform himself to it. To understand better the necessity of God as the archetype for man, indeed for all the created order, we need to understand what is referred to as the analogy of being. Or so we'll say in Latin, the Latin for that, so you feel like you've gotten your money's worth tonight. The analogia entis. The analogia starts from the fact that God creates out of nothing. That is, all created being is contingent. Everything we see in the world has a cause for its existence. There's nothing that we don't experience in the visible world that doesn't have a cause. We can't regress back infinitely. This regression of causality. There has to be a stopping point. If there's no starting point that doesn't need to have something as a cause for its existence, we don't get started. This starting point, therefore, must be God. God is non-contingent in his being. In fact, we can say his essence, really what he is to exist. His very nature is to be. We recall that he reveals to Moses at the burning bush, I am who am. St. John Paul II said that there's a remarkable connection between these two truths from philosophy and from divine revelation. So God's very nature is existence, a necessary logical deduction. Thus, when God creates, he has only himself upon to which to base his creation. Or in other words, we can say that God can't be inspired, for there's nothing outside of him that he did not already create. There's nothing outside of him to do the inspiring. So what that tells us about the created order is that it is not arbitrary. Creation, therefore, must conform itself to the divine archetype, or it necessarily suffers what we would call disorder. In fact, failure to conform to the divine archetype is the reason for disorder in the world. Therefore, man must understand himself as created in the image of love, which is total self-gift. Man is made for love. But we must also say that love is not first a feeling. Rather, feelings are the fruit of love. Love, as we can see from the analogy with the divine processions, is, first of all, an act of the will. It is willing and acting for the good of the other for his own sake. How this total self-gift manifests itself in human relationships varies based upon the requirements of the particular relationship. However, what is common to all relationships, regardless of the depth of mutual obligation, is that in every relationship, one must act and will in such a way that is disinterested. That is, one wills and acts for the good of the other without regard to any self-benefit. As a consequence, we can never simply use another person for any reason. This disinterested love is an act of total self-gift. This is the Trinitarian paradox. St. Paul of Tarsus puts it this way. He says, it is more blessed to give than to receive, citing a tradition from Jesus himself. St. John Paul II says it in another way that reflects the Trinitarian paradox, that man can only fulfill himself by giving himself away. To the degree we fail to live our relationships in this way, we diminish ourselves. We deny ourselves the joy of authentic relationships, and we end up damaging or destroying our relationships. We now come to the issue of human complementarity. Recall the Analogia Entis tells us that every positive creation in the created order reflects the divine archetype. Masculinity and femininity are created goods, and so they necessarily reflect some perfection in God. In terms of the Trinity, we can see that the Father and the Son are relational names. In other words, there is no Father without the Son, and no Son without the Father. The same is true of the Holy Spirit, though admittedly this is not as obvious from this name. The persons are eternal relations in themselves. Some theologians see in this a divine complementarity in the Son and the Father that leads to the fruitfulness of the Holy Spirit. In other words, created masculinity and femininity are finite reflections of this eternal, infinite complementarity. Man and woman are made for each other, and this can be seen in their unique capacity to be fruitful, to give life. The very command that God gave to man when he said that man was made in his image and likeness as man and woman. As such, the most intimate manner of human love is spousal love. And this is marked by total self-gift of the entirety of the persons, including their fertility. The two becoming one is predicated on the form of the act being open to their becoming three. Because the body is a way of reflecting God's love for man, a theory developed by Aristotle and adopted by St. Thomas Aquinas called hylomorphism can help us to see this seamless integration of a unitive act of love with a procreative act of love. Hylomorphism says that all visible beings are a unity of an immaterial aspect we call the form and a material aspect we call matter. They are not two pre-existing things, but one seamless entity with two aspects. Applied to human beings, the soul is the form and the body is the matter. The soul is the cause of the body's existence, of its shape, its self-organization, and its locomotion. The soul is the principle also of the spiritual faculties. Therefore, the soul is the seat, the source of communion. Recall, the intellect is to know the other, so that the will can choose the good of the other, to love him. The soul is the foundation of communion. The body and soul form a seamless unity. Wherever the body is, there is the soul. When the soul is separated from the body, death comes about. The matter and the form cannot exist without one another. This radical unity also indicates that the body makes the soul visible and touchable. The matter is also the principle of individuation. It is the cause of our being an individual. Thus, we are individuals who simultaneously are made for communion. The body is also the principle in procreation. Here the parents give to the child only his body, his materiality, his DNA. The unitive and procreative meanings of the marital act arise, therefore, from the body and the soul respectively. And so they also form a seamless unity. There cannot be one without the other. In this way, when one attempts the marital act of love, that is sexual intercourse, the act dies if the unitive and procreative meanings are not simultaneously present as one unity. Any other act of sexual intercourse does not conform to the divine archetype of total self-giving, and so is by definition disordered. In this way, such an act is not one of love, but of use. Each person uses the other as a means of achieving some end. However good the end may be, the use of one another is never justified, even through mutual consent. But there is another aspect of the body-soul unity that provides us insight into the necessity of reciprocal complementarity for spousal love. Recall, the body reveals the soul because the soul gives the body its form, its shape. So when we see the body, we see in a sense what the soul looks like. Love, as we saw in the divine processions, is hierarchical. The Father initiates, the Son actively receives, then reinitiates, and the Father then receives the Son back. Human complementarity, or human sexual complementarity, reflects this. We can see that masculinity is first initiating and then receptive in return. Human femininity is first actively receptive and then reinitiating in return. This can be seen really in the body from gross anatomy all the way down to the level of the gametes, that is, between the sperm and the egg. And every point in between, this is apparent. The structure, therefore, of the body reveals the structure of the soul. A male soul first initiates love and then receives it. A feminine soul first receives love and then initiates. But the soul and the body is a unity. Sexual love, therefore, is necessarily complementary. For it to be authentically human, it must be sexually complementary. Ultimately, the marital act is ordered to love. It is ordered to initiating and receptive love, which can be seen in the body, but is not limited to the body. Spousal love is necessarily complementary, and so necessarily ordered to procreative fruitfulness. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Delaney. Thank you, Dr. Delaney. That's got me writing a bunch of questions here, and I'm sure some of you have some questions. We're going to take a short break, and I believe some of the Knights of Columbus are going to be passing out some cards, so if you've got them or if you've got a question, please write them down, grab some refreshments, and we'll be back to continue on with your questions in about 5 to 6 minutes. Well, one of the things that I picked up on that I'd like to ask, and I'll start off with Mike. Hopefully I asked this correctly. Does the restriction of marriage to just to heterosexuals deprive homosexuals of a civil right? You know, in today's gay rights movement, is it analogous to the civil rights movement of the 1960s? Does that kind of make sense? Did I ask that right?
Yeah, that's certainly a very popular argument. You hear that all the time. It's really the favorite argument of proponents of same-sex marriage. Attorney General Holder says that all the time, and the president also frequently says that same-sex marriage is the same as, is sort of continuous with the 1950s, 1960s civil rights struggle. If this is true, it's an extremely powerful point, maybe even a decisive point. But it's not true. There are several reasons, several big differences between the debates and between the participants in the debates that show it's not true. Even President Obama, although he said that he has compared the gay rights movement or the same-sex marriage movement to the civil rights movement, he's also said, hey, I've got friends on the other side, they're good people, they're well-meaning people, and they want to do the right thing. That's not really the kind of thing that we say about racists. You know, you don't really just say, oh yeah, here's my friend the racist, or my friend the anti-Semite. So I think that's one big difference, the way the terminology the president's using. And I think you also see it, and we touched on this a little bit, that there is just there's a big range of opinion in the gay movement. When you had the civil rights movement, there was nobody who was affected. There were no African Americans, I don't think, who were against voting rights. I don't think there was anyone in Mississippi who said, no, we do not want the right to vote. Whereas in this movement, you truly do have gay rights activists who do not want this, who consider this a sellout. Say, if you go in for marriage, you're buying into an archaic institution. You're buying into bourgeois values. So there's some people in the gay community who specifically are against marriage. And then there's probably a much bigger group who's in favor of same-sex marriage, but they want it to alter the institution, to sort of fix marriage, to make it more flexible, to make it not monogamous, but monogamish, as Dan Savage says. And this also is a big difference from the civil rights movement. There was no, in the goods that the civil rights pioneers were trying to obtain, there was no difference in what they were. I mean, as far as, riding on the bus, where to sit on the bus, ending segregation, voting rights, being able to stay in hotels, public accommodations. There's no difference in actually what those goods were, but here there really is. If you ask this question, what is marriage, or what should marriage be, how will marriage be affected, there's a big difference of opinion in the gay community. So I think that it's one of the most important points is to be able to, as you talk about this with your friends and family, to be able to address this point. It's almost a given. I saw a presentation on C-SPAN about a book that concerned the companion case to Windsor, and both the interviewer and the interviewee kept saying, oh yeah, this was the new civil rights movement. This is the 5 or 10 times, and I think that's something that we really need to answer because it's simply not the case.
Thank you, Mike. I'll ask this one to Dr. Delaney. Why does the church teach that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered and contrary to the natural law? I think that's Catechism 2357.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yes, that's a very difficult question because of the way that we normally think about the term disordered. It seems to be a very pejorative term. At the outset, we really have to treat, I think, this disorder. It's called same-sex attraction disorder most properly. People that suffer from this in a very compassionate way. And this is really from, the identity, one's personal identity, right, is as a man or a woman. We only exist as a male or female. We don't exist any other way. And there is a particular inclination, as I pointed out. I didn't talk about inclinations, but as I pointed out, this sexual complementarity between two people is the only way of authentically exercising sexual complementarity. Because the sexual inclination is so intricately tied up with one's identity as a male or as a female, one cannot integrate themselves. One cannot become, you're never at home with yourself if you are not at home with your identity as a male or female. And that's that correlation to one's sexual inclination. This means that this indicates that those who suffer from this disorder live in a world that they are alienated from themselves. And if they're alienated from themselves, they can't but be alienated from one another. One first has to be integrated around themselves. So what we see now in society today is really a manifestation, a result of this disorder. So the term disorder really refers simply to the fact that the person's inclination does not correspond to their sexual identity. And the ramifications of this are extreme. They're extreme for the person and the person's ability to interrelate with one another. We can see this, again, we said that we're body-soul unity. I use that fancy term, hylomorphism, another term you can write down and impress your family and friends with, right? But we're a body-soul unity. Where there is one, there is the other. Everything in the soul has a manifestation, and everything in the soul interfaces, if you will, with the outside world through the body and vice versa. Everything that happens to the soul happens to the body and vice versa. And so here we have this indication, which we can see from the sexual organs, right? The sexual organs have only one meaning, as genitalia. The term genitalia, right, not to be too indelicate, but it begins, the very meaning of genitalia, or the genitals, right, is generation. They're ordered to procreation. Masculine and feminine genitalia have no meaning other than in the face of one another, in the same way that masculinity has no meaning other than in the face of femininity. So masculinity and femininity, in their very natures, are not something. They're more like someone. It's a way of being a person. They are relational in a way that the Father and the Son, in an analogous way that the Father and the Son are relational. And so inclinations have to serve these purposes. And if our inclinations don't serve these purposes, then we know by their very natures, their disorders, something is wrong. And we can see that in the empirical data. The empirical evidence shows us. And I just want to mention a little bit. I mean, it's very obvious in many ways that if we use certain aspects of our body incorrectly, in ways that they weren't intended, problems come about. And there are many problems that come about. One of these, for example, anal cancer is 4,000 times more prevalent among those men who engage, against those who regularly engage in anal intercourse. 4,000 times. But there are many other types of anorectal problems as well. In fact, one way of seeing what portion of the town, what side of the town, of a particular city, is in fact predominantly those who suffer from same-sex attraction disorder, is to go to the phone book and see where most proctologists have set up businesses. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just pointing out the fact that there is clearly biological results, negative biological results. I mean, to not recognize this, to not say this, is akin to, saying the emperor's clothes, look very nice, right? But there are other psychological, as well as, I've got a long list if you're interested in other types of diseases that are transmitted. And some of them as sexually transmitted diseases. And some of them are so very rarely transmitted sexually, but they're found only among those in the same-sex attraction disorder community. But it's not just the physical problem, right? We're body-soul unities. The manifestation of the physical problems also have a psychological and emotional, spiritual manifestation. Suicide. Suicide is many times greater among those in the same-sex attraction community, those who live that particular lifestyle, than those who do not. I'll just mention a couple of interesting studies. One was a gay twin study. This gay twin study was between twins who grew up together. One became a practicing gay, and one twin grew up heterosexually. This was very significant because it helped to isolate the types of, not completely, but it helped to isolate to some degree, right, environmental factors. And they found that the suicide rate among those who grew up gay, and this means gay basically by its definition means that they practice homosexuality, was 6.5 times higher. That's 650% more likely that the gay twin would commit suicide than the non-gay twin. Oftentimes, these types of emotional, psychological problems are attributed to the claim that it is because of the homophobic environments, right? But there are other studies. These types of results are pretty much the same throughout all societies. One particularly interesting one was a Denmark study. In Denmark, the Netherlands, the acceptance of the gay lifestyle, of those who are gay, socially, was pretty much complete by the mid-1960s. So we have a generation passed. They looked at the period of time between 1990 and 2001, after the legalization of same-sex registered relationships became available in Denmark. And this is what they found. They found that they were 8 times more likely, those who lived in partnerships, of committing suicide. 800% times more, or 800% more likely to commit suicide than heterosexual men. This is something that is recognized. In fact, you can go to the website for Gay and Lesbian Medical Association that identifies all of these problems. They recognize all of these problems. But again, there is an incapacity to say that there's a correlation between the way that people are choosing to live. Not choosing, their inclinations oftentimes are not chosen, at least not explicitly. At least most of them are not aware of making decisions that lead them in that direction. That's a precision that I'm making for those that might be aware of the connection between disorder and decision making. But for the most part, they're not aware of it. And so here we have to be very clear about it. In fact, really in Canada, there was an interesting event in 2009. There was an LGBT activist group actually sued. They sued or they actually filed a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission because of this inordinate number of or levels of maladies that those who suffer from this disorder experience. And they're saying, well, this is the result of a lack of equality. You're not providing enough government resources towards those that live the gay lifestyle, in order to bring these kind of statistics down. So again, we're talking about something that we just aren't putting 2 and 2 together, primarily because the ramifications or making the natural consequence of that, of putting these 2 things together, really undermines the arguments, especially as the civil rights arguments that Mike was making. But again, there's a lot more that could be said, but that probably is enough for now.
Thank you. I had the opportunity to get my hair cut with someone who I quickly found out experienced same-sex attraction. And over the course of about a year and a half, we engaged in conversation, and some of the conversations we had got a little intense, and I thought, at any moment he'd make me bald quicker than I wanted to be. But I thought, they persecuted Christ, and I thought, I'll go for it, but out of love and with love. And at one point, the conversation escalated, and he looked at me, and it was. I wasn't clear on if he was upset or sad, but he asked me, why would God make me this way and not want me to act on it? Has the church defined whether they believe those that experience same-sex attraction, is that hereditary or is that environment?
That's a very good question, Richard. Yeah, the church actually talks about that in Catechism. It says, this is what it reads in paragraph 2357. It said, it is, referring to the topic of homosexuality, it says, it has taken a great variety of forms through the centuries and in different cultures. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained. And what this means is that there is not consensus. There is not much consensus. Those who are in the medical community who recognize this as a disorder, this is one of the big complaints that they have about the APA, the American Psychological Association, because they have made this and there are a variety of reasons of why the APA has removed this as a disorder. A couple of reasons, but by doing this, they have made it impossible for the causes to be investigated anymore. And in fact, any psychiatrist, anybody that tries to do it these days, really will be accused of malpractice. You can't do science in in medicine, psychological medicine these days. So, but what we could say to this, right, is that it doesn't really matter, right, what the cause is. It doesn't really matter what the cause of a disorder is. We can see a disorder. We can see in the biological order that cancer is a disorder. We don't know the cause in many cases of cancer, but we do know that it's disordered. We know that it interrupts the natural function of the human organism, right, biologically. We can see in the same way, through empirical evidence, just through dispassionate, both through reason alone and the empirical evidence, that it is disordered. We can see it, again, and I make it, it's very important to recognize, right? We can see it without making recourse to divine revelation, to the authority of the church. It doesn't take that. We can see it through the medical evidence, and we can see it through reason alone, and what we know, I think, some of the arguments that Mike made earlier show that to be the case.
Thank you. Mike, it's for you. To what degree has the state involvement in marriage, as in justice of the peace, quote-unquote contracts, reduced the reverence for conjugal marriage?
I'm sorry, to repeat?
Sure. To what degree has the state involvement in marriage reduced the reverence for conjugal marriage, as in justice of the peace and the contracts?
I don't think that state involvement itself is necessarily bad. I think the state has a legitimate interest in marriage. There are some fields where both the church and the state have legitimate interests. Education is one, and marriage is another. The state's interest in marriage is, again, to ensure that it's not the state raising fatherless children. It's not the state ends up, a child who grows up, or a boy who grows up without a father is 20 times more likely to be incarcerated, 5 times more likely to be in poverty, and 9 times more likely to drop out of high school. So the state has an interest in preventing these outcomes. So I don't think it's a difficulty with the state being involved in marriage, but obviously now that we've got same-sex marriage, we do have a great number of difficulties because it's really being imposed, and it's being imposed without a true understanding of marriage. And I do think the state role is going to be examined more. When in the Windsor case that I mentioned, the controlling case, the most important one, they said that there are 1,000 federal laws that have to do with marriage, that have to do with marriage benefits. Some people are concerned that there's this movement in marriage, kind of, partly for social standing, partly because people want their union recognized and accepted socially, but also there are a lot of benefits and perks that come with it. And I think there may be an examination of the question: are there too many benefits? Are there too many perks attached to marriage? And I think that might be a good conversation to have.
Thank you. This one, can a Catholic in good conscience attend a gay, quote-unquote, marriage for a close friend or family member?
Yes. No, that is a very difficult question, and it's one that we have to take very seriously, right? I think most of us recognize the difficulty or the problem in doing that. We do want to, and we must, reaffirm the dignity of everyone who suffers from this disorder. And we must be able to allow people to make their own decisions, right? But one cannot be incorporated into something that is disordered. We have to recognize that this relationship that is, that in reality is a fiction, one's attendance there is a ratification of that. We, of course, desire their best. We desire their happiness. But we know that happiness cannot come about. Happiness cannot be the result of this union. And in fact, we see in the statistics that the union is not going to last very long. Statistically, we see the breakup of these relationships about a year and a half. About a year and a half is the average for those who commit themselves to these relationships. I think that you see less than 5% that go beyond 8 years of both relationships between men and women. We see within these relationships, we see a high percentage, a very high level of domestic violence between the two partners. And it is because it is disordered. It is not possible to will and work for the good of the other when you're at the same time using the other in a way that really turns oneself inward. It makes oneself more and more selfish just by its very nature. This may not be the intention, and oftentimes it's not the intention, but it is the necessary consequence of these disordered relationships. And so, as difficult as the situation is, as much as you want to and must work to keep a good relationship with a loved one who suffers from this disorder, and try to do nothing to undermine their recognition that you authentically love and care for them. This would be something that would actually harm them in the long run rather than help them.
Thank you. Here's one. Why not just redefine marriage? Is not traditional marriage, the definition of marriage, heterosexist? Our cultures and our society has changed over the centuries. Why don't we just change the definition to reflect what our culture is doing?
That's another fairly popular argument, and it's really taken hold in some of the court cases. The Supreme Court of Iowa said that exact thing. They said, well, marriage changes. Marriage is really a state-created institution, they said, and it changes over time, and we can just recognize the change. The problem with this approach is that if we make this change, it sends the message that dads don't matter. That's the real problem. There's always going to be a mother involved when children are born. But if we're saying endorsing same-sex marriage really says that for the purposes of parenting, either marriage has nothing to do with parenting, or if it does, then sexual complementarity and parenting complementarity don't matter. Whereas the studies show that children do the best with a biological mother and a biological father in just about every outcome that you can. I think actually in every outcome that you can measure. I think there are some that might be equal, but in many of them, the traditional biological mother and father, that environment is the one that's most helpful to the children. As far as things like poverty, educational level, do they go to jail, all suicide, depression, these kinds of outcomes. And then there's another question that is sometimes an unstated assumption in that question is, well, what if we were going to say, or maybe some people do agree with this, that we are going to say the fundamental nature of marriage can change. Let's say you believe that. How do you measure that change? What's the barometer of that change? How do you look out to the world and know that that change has occurred? If you were going to talk about this in political terms, you would think that the votes of the people would count for something. And where the people have voted, the people in the U.S. have voted in 34 states as to whether they wanted traditional marriage or same-sex marriage. And in 31 of the 34 states, they voted for traditional marriage. That should count for something, you would think. But the Iowa Supreme Court said that it's going to, and other courts too, but it's going to decide that the change has occurred, so we're going to redefine marriage. This is really an unworkable solution. There's no if you accept this, there's really no limit of change. You can really change the nature and meaning of marriage can change at any time for any purpose. And again, what you're doing is you're really experimenting on children. When you do this, you're saying that marriage is about adult satisfaction. It's not about the care and raising of children.
Thank you. During this past, I think September-ish, I had and I consider it a beautiful opportunity to speak before the City Council on the proposed revisions to the non-discrimination ordinance. And through a friend who was there with me, who went outside for about an hour and came back in, she met a couple that were born male, had transgender operations, and were now a couple. They are forgive me if I get it incorrect, LGBTQIAS and some other letters. They were the I, intersexuals. Whoa, I mean, it hurt. I didn't know how to understand that, couldn't compute. But I shared that with that same friend of mine, my barber. I'll tell you a little bit of the story. He, over the past year or 2 years that we talked, he received his first Holy Communion and was confirmed in the Catholic Church, so praise God for that. So I continued our conversations. So I shared with him this experience of meeting these intersexuals, and he had some non-charitable things to say about the situation, and said that they needed some help, and I quickly addressed that. But how should we be responding to situations like that? I understand, is it Facebook has 52 different choices for sexuality or male or female? I mean, what can we do in that kind of a culture? Either one of you can do that one. And that wraps up our evening. Thank you so much.
I think what we do is what you've been doing, Richard, is to respond in love and to be willing to listen, but not to compromise the truth. And I think that there is a lot of truth also in these arguments or the assumptions from the proponents of same-sex marriage. This pain that they feel, some of these things connected with what Dr. Delaney's mentioned, that's a real thing. And I think that there's this temptation to say, well, if we have same-sex marriage, then we're going to be happy. And I think over the last 100 years, we've tinkered with marriage a number of times, and there's always been this argument, if we make this change, we're going to be happy. About 100 years ago, if we make divorce more easy, then all these people are going to be happy. And then about 40 years ago, if we have no-fault divorce, we're going to have healthier marriages. People are going to be much happier because they won't be stuck in these marriages. And these things have not made people happy. I mean, the question of the pain and the difficulty of marriage, and certainly the difficulty of being a same-sex attracted person, those are real things. But I think that this is a false solution. I think the origin of the questions that people are asking really do need to be taken seriously. There are real concerns, legitimate concerns, and real pain there, but the solutions that are being offered, especially same-sex marriage, are just not the correct solutions.
Got it. Thank you. Well, if the Catholic Church teaches that homosexuals are neither to marry nor be ordained to the priesthood, does not the Church send a message to gays that they are basically without a vocation? Is it just for the Church to claim that the calling of all gays and lesbians is a lifelong celibacy?
No, that's a very good question. And I think that the answer to that question also can address there's a very common belief about vocation, or perhaps even a misunderstanding about vocation, which would help us, I think, in addressing this question. Everybody thinks that they know what the term vocation is. Most people reduce that vocation to the priesthood, right, or the religious life. But the term vocation really comes from the Latin vocatio, right, which means to call. Vocation is really God's calling, right? God calls us in many different ways. He calls many of us to married life. He calls some to the religious life, some to He calls to the priesthood. He calls some to, believe it or not, he does call some people to the single life. Living single is in fact a calling, and there are many different reasons for that. There are many different possibilities for that. We don't have an adequate theology of living single, and we really need one. We need to develop more completely a theology of being single. But whatever it is that God is calling us to, we have to respond to. There are many different states. Sometimes people get confused between states of life and vocations. The vocation really is what you're called to. If you answer that, or regardless of whether you answer it rightly or wrongly, where you end up is the state of life that you are in. It's ideal if those correspond. That's what spiritual discernment is about. Trying to, rather than choose your vocation, choose what it is that God calls you to. You listen and respond to what He's calling you to. Okay, one also has vocations to the way that you may make a living, right? Whether you're called to be a homemaker. All of these things are vocations. God cares not just about one thing, He cares about everything in our lives. And He calls us to every aspect. Every single decision we make, none are arbitrary. All of them, God is beckoning us to a particular approach. Right? Sometimes there are a multiplicity of possibilities. He allows us freedom to choose. That's why we have the evangelical counsels, right? They're counsels, not commands. So we can say yes or no without violating, without sinning, without violating His will. But for the most part, He's always calling us to something greater. He's with them where we are. So, in a nutshell, if I should wrap that back up to, I suppose, same-sex attraction, right? Those who suffer from this and who cannot be cured of it, and we won't go into the debate about that, but those who suffer from it and are cured of it, just like somebody who suffers from any other malady that may keep them from being married or even living long enough to marry, they're called to something. And they have a purpose. They have a great purpose. They have a purpose that they can accomplish that nobody else can accomplish for them. Oftentimes we don't know exactly what it is. Sometimes we may not know about it till the end of our lives. But we have to be able to show that even though this may require heroism, we're all called to be heroes. We all want to be heroes. We want to be heroes in being able to love God and love one another.
Thank you. We're towards the end of our evening, but I'd like to hear some closing statements from either of you, one then the other, both. Mike, you go first.
One final time to return to Chesterton. One of his other helpful things that he said was that everyone recognizes that there's a ship, large and small, which he ought not to leave, even when he thinks it's sinking. And some people say that the ship of traditional marriage is sinking. The trends seem to be against it, and they seem to be accelerating. Just in this last year, since the Windsor case, there have been 7 states that have adopted same-sex marriage. Most cultural leaders seem to be in favor of same-sex marriage. And some people who we might have expected to defend traditional marriage are not doing it. I agree with Chesterton, and if traditional marriage is sinking, then it nonetheless is a ship that we ought not to abandon. But is it really, in fact, sinking? It does seem to be taking on water, and it's certainly under attack, but is it really sinking? Let's take a look behind the supposed strength of the same-sex marriage movement. How has the stunning advance of the same-sex marriage movement been accomplished? Has it been through the grassroots or through popular initiatives? Somewhat it has, but not for the most part. Most significantly, it has been by judicial decisions. or it's been by state legislatures and other state officials really betraying the people by disregarding their popular vote and then going the other way. Two states where this has happened are California a couple of years ago and Minnesota very recently. Also, in thinking about the strength of the movement, look at the decisions they have to rely on. The Windsor case, the proponents of traditional marriage lost it, but one consolation is not having to rely on such a thin reed as that timid and confused decision. In that case, as I said, they didn't do the analysis you would have expected them to do of are same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples similarly situated. Why didn't they do this? It seems like perhaps they're afraid of asking that question we've been talking about all evening. What is marriage? Instead, the court, the highest court in the land, hurled insults and impugned bad motives rather than really addressing the arguments of the other side or giving a coherent constitutional analysis. Even if the elite opinion seems to be all on one side, and it almost does seem to be the case, the people remain unconvinced. Burke said something to the effect of, if you were dropped in a field and you were blindfolded and you heard the grasshoppers, you would think there was nothing in the field because the grasshoppers were making all the noise. And then if you actually looked and you took the blindfold off, you'd see a multitude of other animals and other life, and you'd see that it's a lot more than the grasshoppers. It's a lot more than these elites who are promoting same-sex marriage. As I said, in 31 of 34 states where the people have gotten to vote, they've voted for traditional marriage. Sometimes we're told, oh, the U.S. is out of the mainstream because we don't have same-sex marriage everywhere. That's not true, but it is true in an ironic way. We are out of the mainstream, but we're out of the mainstream on the other side. There are 180 nations in the United Nations, but only 12 of them have same-sex marriage. And even of those 12, only one has adopted same-sex marriage by judicial decision. In the others, it's been adopted by the legislature. If the Supreme Court goes and takes away the right of states to have same-sex, to decide whether to have same-sex marriage or traditional marriage, will really be only the second country that has that. That is out of the mainstream. Furthermore, international bodies have rejected the argument that same-sex marriage is a human right. The European Court of Justice has rejected it, the European Court of Human Rights, and the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Some people think that the connection between marriage and children already is weakened so much that traditional marriage doesn't really matter anymore. And it has been weakened. It certainly has been weakened. But nonetheless, it remains more powerful than you probably think. Still, most married couples still have children by a large margin. That seems very obvious to say, but it's kind of a basic point, but we should remember it. And you might think that there are all kinds of different arrangements to have children these days. We hear about them all the time. But nonetheless, there are 4 million children born each year in the United States, and 99.5% are still born the old-fashioned way to heterosexual couples. I don't think you'd know that if you just went by the networks. The revisionist view of marriage, it might win out in our country. But even if it does finally succeed, I think that eventually it's going to have to fall apart. How long will it be before it dawns on people that if the court decision on same-sex marriage is correct, then other non-monogamous relationships and non-exclusive and non-permanent relationships also will have to be brought under this thin, now nearly transparent umbrella of marriage? How long before the citizens take a look at federal benefits? If marriage is divorced from the bearing and raising of children, why are we giving such generous benefits to people who aren't bearing and raising children? That's the whole reason we support the institution, so that children are raised well. Why are we subsidizing emotional relationships with little or no connection to this fundamental purpose. We're not subsidizing other relationships, two elderly sisters living together, two upstanding citizen roommates living together. We're not subsidizing those relationships. Why are we subsidizing same-sex marriage? Why are we subsidizing relationships with no connection to children? How long will it be before it dawns on people that all we're doing, if we go down this road, all we're doing is really paying people through benefits to have sex? That's what we're really doing. We're not going to give benefits to the elderly sisters living together. We're not going to give benefits to the bachelor farmers living together, but only if you're in a sexual relationship. The revisionist view of marriage really can't explain why the state has any interest in marriage, why the state has an interest in sexual relationships, and if it does have an interest in sexual relationships, why only sexual relationships involving two people? The conjugal view can explain all of this perfectly. The revisionist view really does not have an answer. I don't want to underestimate the challenges, but we shouldn't give up hope either. Right now, the proponents of same-sex marriage, they're ignoring this question of what marriage is, while I think the defenders of the traditional marriage may not be ready to answer it. I think that's what they really need to answer. We all really need to answer what is marriage. So maybe the ship of traditional marriage seems to be dipping from sight right now, or almost dipping from sight. Indeed, it might even dip still lower. But it's not sinking. It's descending for a moment on a wave. But once the citizens pay attention to what the courts and other elites are doing to our society, and once they realize what a treasure is being squandered in traditional marriage, perhaps we may yet see marriage begin to rise once more. And we may indeed see marriage rise once more, and not only rise, but now that we prize marriage even more for having almost lost it, it may rise on the highest wave of all. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Delaney? Thank you, Mike. Now, Dr. Delaney, that's what I meant.
Yes. I'd like to perhaps just close in calling to mind the spiritual warfare aspect, right? The nature of the spiritual warfare in this struggle. And there are two aspects to it that we have to be aware of, right? The first is that even though this, as Mr. Dunnigan has mentioned, seems to be a very dark time in many ways, and the trajectory doesn't seem to be going in the right way, the right direction. We have to recognize that ultimately that this is not a battle against flesh and blood, because this is something that we're first inclined to, right? Some of us perhaps might see the great challenge in it, and they go game on, right? The difficulty with doing it, with that kind of response, is that we're not going to succeed in helping to heal society, and helping to heal those who need this healing, who need this transformation. And ultimately, we may end up working at cross purposes with God if we try to do it in that way. The other aspect of this, though, no matter how dark things seem to get, we can never give up. We can never think that, well, forget about it. I'll just go and build my compound out in south of town and put up fence, get dogs, right? I mean, that is, in fact, there are many people doing that. There's a large prepper movement. We have to recognize, though, and I had meant to bring that little exchange between Samwise Gamgee and Frodo, right? But that's exactly what we have to recognize, that ultimately, our human efforts, God is going to use our human efforts, right? So this won't be as dramatic as Tolkien, but we have to recognize that the way that God works, right? He works through small things. He works through the mustard seed. right? He works through the seeds of the martyrs to achieve his ends. And what is the seeds of martyrs? The martyrs are witnesses, right? They're those who witness to love, to witness to the truth, right? You don't have one without the other. We have to preach, we have to witness to the truth and love, all the way to our deaths, if we have to. But certainly a white martyrdom, if we're not called to a red martyrdom. He is the one who will provide the success. He's the one who will work through our fidelity. We've heard the phrase, right? God doesn't call us to success. He calls us to fidelity. And that's what we have to remember. We never give up. We love our enemies. And we wish them well. We work for their best. We work for them, regardless of what it is that we're faced with. Thank you.
The time sure did fly, and there were a ton of questions, so I'm actually going to challenge you two guys. I'm going to give you the questions, not right now. And maybe on your websites, on your Facebook pages, you can answer them all. So I'll encourage you all to pick up material at the back for the St. Joseph Foundation and anything that whether the America's Institute may have as well. And look for your questions and look for the answers and communicate with these guys here. They know their stuff, and I implore you, if you got a question, ask somebody. Don't keep it to yourself. Ask, and obviously I'm going to tell you to listen to Catholic radio, but to call in your question as well. It's incumbent upon you to learn about it, and then find somebody else who doesn't know, counsel the ignorant. They can know what that means. Help somebody else. I want to thank Father Phillips for use of Our Lady of the Atonement and wonderful support. Thank you so much. Knights of Columbus, they helped us with the cards. They did a great job with that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. But I will finish off with this part. This is my little personal addition to this. Respond. Respond out of love, but always maintain with love. If you get accused of using that 2x4, put it away. Put it away. If you don't know how to do it, pray about it. It'll come to you. Really, it helps it. Level the playing field, and others will listen to you more. So thank you for your time. God bless you. Please keep these guys in your prayers. Keep me in your prayers, and I will definitely keep you in mind. Thank you, and drive safely. God bless you.